I stood outside my own home, shaking from the icy rain pouring over me, while my son celebrated his birthday inside with his wife and mother-in-law. Through the window, I could see them laughing, opening presents, enjoying themselves as though I had simply vanished from their lives. I watched quietly, soaked to the bone, until a luxury car stopped in front of the house. To my shock, it was my mother. I had always believed she lived a modest, peaceful life on her little ranch out in the countryside. But when she stepped out of that car and saw me standing there in such a miserable state, her eyes darkened with a fury I had rarely seen in her. She glanced toward the house and spoke a single word that cut through the rain like thunder. Destroy. Before this story carries you any further, I hope you're settled in with me. And if you're still here, you're welcome to subscribe for more stories like this whenever you wish. You can also tell me where you're listening from. I always love knowing how far these stories travel. I never imagined a day would come when my own son would leave me standing outside his door. But that is exactly what happened on the night he celebrated another year of life, under a storm that seemed endless. My name is Sarah. I am 53 years old, and everything I have ever done has been for my son. I raised Richard alone after his father walked out on us when the boy was only 5. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to keep our lives afloat, making sure he had good schooling, decent clothes, meals we could rely on. I even sold the jewelry my grandmother left me so I could pay for his college education. All the dreams I once had for myself were set aside so he could reach his own. And he did. He graduated with a degree in business administration, landed an excellent job, married Ashley, a woman from an old money family, and built a comfortable, polished life for himself. When he invited me to live with them in their new home in a quiet, upscale gated community, I didn't hesitate. He was my son. After years of struggle, I thought we might finally share a season of peace together. But what I found was nothing like what I hoped for. From the moment I moved in, I sensed Ashley's disapproval. She had a way of wrinkling her nose when I stepped into the living room, as though the air had changed for the worse. She made subtle remarks about my clothing, my way of speaking, about everything, really. And Richard never said a word in my defense. He would look away, pretend he didn't hear, or quickly change the subject. Her mother, Bertha, was even harder to bear. She wore expensive jewelry, designer outfits, and carried herself with the arrogance of someone who believed the world owed her deference. She treated me like an employee rather than Richard's mother, always inserting herself into decisions, always reminding me that she had wealth and I did not. Day by day, they pushed me further into the shadows of the house. My room was tucked away near the laundry area. I would wake early to prepare breakfast. I cleaned, did the laundry, cooked meals. Ashley never expressed gratitude. Richard barely spent a moment talking to me. I became a ghost inside the very family I helped build. The night of Richard's birthday became the moment everything finally began to crack. I had spent weeks planning that celebration. I wanted it to be perfect for him. I ordered a 3-tier cake, prepared trays of snacks, decorated the living room with balloons and ribbons. I even used the last of my savings to buy him a watch he had once mentioned wanting. On the day of the party, I was up by 5 in the morning. My back ached, my legs felt heavy, but none of it mattered. It was for Richard. By 7 that evening, guests began to arrive and the house looked beautiful. But right away, something felt wrong. Richard greeted me with a quick gesture that felt more like brushing me aside before slipping back into his conversations. Ashley floated around the room in an extravagant dress, soaking up compliments. Bertha stood proudly beside her, introducing her daughter-in-law as though she were a celebrity. And I served drinks, collected empty glasses, and carried trays of appetizers. Not a single person introduced me as the mother of the birthday boy. Not one thank you was spoken. I was treated like hired help in a home where I washed the floors and folded the laundry. At one point, I tried to approach Richard with my gift. He barely looked at me. He muttered a dismissive "not now, Mom," without lifting his eyes from his business partners. The pain of that moment pierced straight through me, sharp and unrelenting. Then Bertha came to find me in the kitchen. I was washing dishes when she walked in wearing that practiced smile that always carried more venom than kindness. Her voice had that syrupy tone she used whenever she wanted to insult me while pretending she wasn't. She told me I looked out of place at the party, my clothes too simple, my presence embarrassing Richard in front of his friends. I swallowed the ache rising in my throat and whispered that I was his mother, that I had every right to be there. She laughed, a short, cruel sound, and told me I had served my purpose when Richard was a little boy who needed someone to raise him. Now, she said, he had a real family. I was nothing more than an uncomfortable reminder of a past they wanted to forget. Her words hit me like blows. I stood there with a wet plate in my hands while she stripped away what little dignity I had left. She told me if she were in my place, she would leave the party so the real people could celebrate in peace. Then she turned and walked away, leaving behind a cloud of expensive perfume and bitterness. For several minutes, I stood frozen, shaking, not from the temperature but from anger mixed with hurt. How had my life come to this? How had my own son allowed them to diminish me in such a way? I knew I had to speak to Richard. I needed to look him in the eye and ask when I stopped mattering, when all the sacrifices I made had stopped having value. I walked into the living room. The party was alive with laughter and music. Richard stood near the gift table, opening presents beside Ashley. Bertha watched them proudly, as if she alone carried the right to call herself family. I walked toward them with my heart pounding. I called Richard's name, but my voice was swallowed by the noise. I tried again, louder. He finally looked at me, and irritation crossed his face as though I were interrupting something grand. He told me he was busy. I told him it was important. He dismissed me again. And something inside me, something I had been holding together for years, finally broke. I raised my voice. The room went silent. Even though the music played on, everything else came to a halt. Eyes turned toward us. I told him I spent my life working myself to exhaustion for him. I told him how he was treating me like nothing. Ashley stepped closer with a look of disgust and whispered how embarrassing this was. Bertha jumped in, calling me classless and demanding Richard handle the situation. And then the unimaginable happened. Richard grabbed my arm hard enough to make me gasp. He dragged me toward the front door while the guests stared in disbelief. His voice was cold, unfamiliar. He said I had ruined his night with my drama and neediness. I begged him to stop, but he kept pulling me until we reached the door. Outside, the storm raged fiercely. Rain hammered the ground like a warning. He opened the door and told me I had to leave. I stared at him, stunned, reminding him it was pouring outside. He didn't care, he wanted me gone. And he told me not to return until I learned how to behave. Before I could fully understand what was unfolding, Richard shoved me out the door. I stumbled forward, nearly slipping on the drenched porch. I called his name, pleading through the storm, but he only stared back with eyes as cold as the rain falling around me, eyes that no longer held a trace of the little boy I once carried in my arms, the son I had loved with every part of myself. He told me I had always been a burden, speaking with a calmness far more frightening than anger. He said he had built his life in spite of me, not because of me, and that he finally had a real family now, a family that held value. Then he slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frame. A moment later, I heard the lock turn. I stood motionless as the rain began to soak through my clothes. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. My own son had thrown me out of the house, into a storm, as if I were nothing more than an unwanted creature. The sky opened with a violence that felt almost personal, as though the heavens themselves were mourning for me. Within seconds, my clothes clung to my skin, heavy and cold. The chill seeped deep into my bones, making me tremble uncontrollably. I began pounding on the door, my fists slipping against the wet wood as I cried out for Richard. I begged him to let me back in, told him it was freezing, pleaded for mercy. But there was only silence. The only sound was the relentless rain, and faintly, in the distance, the party continuing inside as though nothing had happened. As though I had never existed. My knocks grew weaker until my hands throbbed with pain. Tears blended with the rain on my cheeks, the two indistinguishable from one another. When I finally stopped, my feet numb inside my soaked shoes, I moved toward the large living room window. Through the fogged glass, I could see everything. And what I saw broke me completely. The celebration had resumed without interruption. The music played, guests laughed, they drank, they danced. Richard stood at the center of it all, smiling broadly as people congratulated him. Ashley stayed close at his side, glowing with elegance. Bertha moved gracefully among the guests, offering smiles and lively conversation. Not a single person mentioned what had happened. No one seemed troubled by the fact that Richard's mother had been cast out into a storm. I pressed my frozen hands against the glass and watched them as if I were a spirit peering into the world of the living. I was only a few yards away, yet the distance felt immeasurable. I was invisible, expendable. They brought out the cake next, the same cake I had ordered using nearly all of my savings. Richard and Ashley held the knife together, cutting the first slice as everyone applauded. They shared a look filled with intimacy, completely unaware of the devastation just outside the window. Bertha handed Richard a piece of cake with a warm, affectionate smile, the kind a mother should give. The role that should have belonged to me. My throat tightened painfully. I was trembling so violently I could barely stand. The cold was unbearable, cutting through me like a blade. My lips were numb. My fingers felt lifeless. I don't know how long I remained there. Time had dissolved. It could have been 20 minutes or it could have been hours. Only the storm existed, the cold, and the cruel vision framed by that window. Eventually, my legs gave way. I sank onto the muddy ground, sitting in a puddle of rainwater and earth. I no longer had the strength to rise. I barely had the strength to breathe. Memories rushed through my mind in waves. Richard as a baby crying in the middle of the night, and me rocking him gently even after working a double shift. Richard as a child falling from his bike, and me rushing to tend to his scraped knees. Richard as a teenager receiving his college acceptance letter, and the two of us jumping with joy in our tiny apartment. Where had it all gone so wrong? When did my son turn into a stranger with such a cold and unyielding heart? The rain showed no mercy. I began coughing, my chest tightening painfully. The cold clawed at me, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, by hurt, humiliation, and a betrayal I could not yet make sense of. Through the fogged window, I watched Richard open gifts wrapped in expensive, beautifully decorated paper. He smiled gratefully for each one. He thanked everyone generously. And my gift, the watch I had bought him with my last bit of savings, was nowhere to be seen, forgotten just as I had been. Guests began to dance, filling the room with energy, movement, joy. Meanwhile, I sat outside, shivering in the mud, fading from their world as though I had never belonged to it. Did anyone think of me? Did anyone wonder where the mother of the birthday boy had gone? Or had they all accepted whatever story Ashley and Bertha had woven, painting me as a problem, a disruption, someone who had to be removed? I closed my eyes, wishing for the ground to take me away from the pain. And then I heard a new sound, the low, powerful hum of an engine. I opened my eyes, struggling to see through the rain and tears. A large black car rolled slowly toward the house. It gleamed even in the downpour, the kind of vehicle you only saw in movies or wealthier neighborhoods. It stopped directly in front of the house. I watched, confused, unable to imagine who could be arriving at this hour. Perhaps another wealthy guest. The driver's door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. He carried a large umbrella and hurried to the back door, opening it with a quiet respect. Then someone stepped out of the car. Even through the heavy rain, I knew her instantly. My mother. But not the version of her I had always known. Not the woman who lived in the countryside growing vegetables and raising chickens. This woman wore an exquisite designer coat, elegant shoes, and held a handbag that likely cost more than most people's cars. She moved with a confidence, a strength, an authority I had never witnessed in her before. When the streetlight hit her face, I saw age etched into her features, but her eyes burned with a fierce intensity. She spotted me immediately, sitting in the mud, drenched, trembling, shattered. Her face twisted with fury, a fury so powerful I felt the air shift around her. She hurried toward me, the chauffeur shielding her with the umbrella. When she reached me, she knelt down in the mud without caring for her expensive clothing and cupped my face in her hands. She spoke my name, her voice trembling with emotion. She called me her daughter and demanded to know what they had done to me. I couldn't speak. I could only cry. She wrapped her arms around me, pulling me into a tight, protective embrace. For the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of warmth, the warmth of a mother's unwavering love. A love I had once given to my own son, only for him to cast it aside. My mother helped me stand and removed her luxurious coat, draping it over my shoulders. The chauffeur supported me gently. As she looked toward the living room window, seeing the party inside, Richard laughing, the guests celebrating, the life continuing as if nothing had happened, her eyes narrowed into something sharp and deadly. Two large men emerged from a second vehicle I hadn't noticed before, clearly bodyguards. They approached her silently, waiting for direction. She stared at the house one more time, her hand tightening around an ornate cane I had never seen her use. Then she spoke a single word, a word heavy with authority, a word that chilled me even more than the storm: destroy. The bodyguards nodded and moved toward the front door without hesitation. I stared at my mother, bewildered, still trembling from the cold and the shock of everything unraveling around me. I could barely form words. I asked her who she really was, what all of this meant. She looked at me with a tenderness that softened the fierce fire I'd seen in her eyes moments earlier. She told me she was someone who never should have allowed my suffering to reach this point, someone who had mistakenly believed that keeping her distance would protect me, a mistake she now understood too well. Before I could utter another word, the bodyguards reached the door. One of them didn't bother knocking. He lifted his foot and kicked with such force that the door splintered and flew inward, pieces of the frame scattering across the floor. The crack echoed through the stormy night. Through the window, I watched the exact instant the party froze. Music cut off mid-beat. Voices died instantly. A glass shattered somewhere near the dining table. Every head snapped toward the entryway. Shock washed across countless faces, eyes widening, mouths falling open over untouched drinks and half-eaten cake. The two bodyguards stepped into the house with commanding, deliberate strides. They were imposing figures in dark suits that carried the unmistakable structure of military tailoring. Their expressions were unreadable, their presence suffocating. They were men accustomed to carrying out orders, not debating them. Richard was the first to react. He stepped forward, his face turning a furious shade of red, though I could see fear flickering beneath his anger. His voice shook as he demanded to know who they were and ordered them to leave. He threatened to call the police, his words brittle with panic. The bodyguards acted as though he hadn't spoken at all. They positioned themselves at either side of the entrance, forming a solemn corridor. They stood tall, hands clasped in front, gazes fixed forward. And then my mother entered. She walked slowly, leaning lightly on her cane, but every step carried weight and authority. The chauffeur followed behind her, holding the umbrella though the rain was now outside. I stood at her side, still wrapped in her coat, still trembling, supported gently by another bodyguard. The room fell into utter silence as we stepped inside. I must have looked like a ghost, drenched, pale, my clothes plastered to my skin, my legs streaked with mud. My mother, in contrast, looked like a ruler reclaiming a kingdom. Richard's eyes flicked toward me, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw guilt or concern surface. But it vanished so quickly I wasn't sure it had been real. He asked what was happening, trying desperately to sound authoritative even though his voice wavered. He demanded to know who those people were and what my mother had done. She didn't answer him right away. Her gaze traveled around the room, examining every detail, every expensive decoration, every polished surface, every symbol of the life that had been built on her silent support. Ashley clung to Richard with a pale, frightened face. Bertha stepped forward, hands on her hips, trying to appear bold, but fear trembled beneath her mask of arrogance. She demanded to know who my mother thought she was and ordered her to leave, threatening again to call the police. My mother finally turned to her with a stare so cold that Bertha instinctively backed up half a step. She invited Bertha to call the police if she wished and gestured for a bodyguard to hand Bertha a phone. She even suggested asking the commissioner which side he preferred to stand on. Something in my mother's voice, something absolute, made Bertha falter and pull her hand back instead of taking the phone. Richard switched tactics. He claimed this was all a misunderstanding, saying I had caused a scene, and he had simply asked me to calm down outside. Calm down, My mother repeated those words with a venom that made the room tremble. She told him exactly what he had done, that he had locked his own mother outside in the middle of a storm, the same woman who had raised him alone, sold her jewelry to pay for his education, worked tirelessly to give him a life of dignity. Richard paled instantly. He tried to speak, but my mother cut him off, saying she knew every sacrifice I had made for him, every tear I had shed, every piece of myself I had given. Then she said she knew exactly how much he was worth, and that amount was nothing. She struck her cane against the floor, and the sharp crack echoed through the room like a weapon being fired. She announced her name, Margaret Sanders, and I watched several guests turn white as snow when they recognized it. She told Richard that everything he had, the house, the job, the car, belonged to her. He stumbled back, stunned, asking what she meant. She signaled to the chauffeur, who handed her a leather briefcase. She opened it and revealed stacks of documents. She asked Richard if he truly believed he had achieved all of this alone. She explained that no recent college graduate with no credit history simply walks into a managerial role or obtains a loan for such a home. She revealed every door she had opened for him, every connection she had used, every investment she had made, not for Richard, but for me, because she wanted her daughter to have a peaceful life. And in return, he had humiliated the very woman who had loved him most. The room thickened with silence. You could hear the ragged breaths of everyone standing there. Richard picked up the documents with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the pages, widening with each passing line. His voice cracked as he whispered that it couldn't be true, that he had earned everything. My mother laughed, a laugh void of humor. She called him mediocre, pointed out his poor school performance, his barely acceptable work record. She reminded him she had personally secured his job and paid his mortgage 3 times the previous year when he fell behind. Ashley screamed that it was all a lie, but Richard saw the truth in the papers. He whispered that it was all true. Bertha, desperate to regain control, asked my mother how much money she wanted. My mother's eyes gleamed dangerously as she asked if Bertha truly believed this was about money. She gave a signal. Start. The house shook with sudden chaos. The bodyguards worked with startling efficiency. They didn't harm a single person, but they dismantled the environment with merciless precision. The gift table was overturned, presents scattering across the floor. The 3-tier cake I had lovingly chosen was swept off the table and splattered across the ground. Paintings were torn down, crystal vases shattered, curtains ripped from their rods. The expensive sound system was unplugged and hurled aside. Guests screamed and ran toward the walls, pressing themselves out of the way. Ashley sobbed hysterically. Bertha tried to interfere but was gently pushed away. Richard yelled for them to stop, insisting the house was his, but my mother calmly told him he was wrong. More people entered, lawyers carrying briefcases. One explained that the property belonged to a holding company controlled by Margaret Sanders, and Richard was only a temporary beneficiary. The agreement could be revoked at any time, especially if he violated the clause requiring respectful treatment of family members, specifically me. Richard's mouth fell open. He stammered that he had never read the contract and didn't even know my mother had been involved. My mother told him ignorance was no excuse. Guests fled the scene, slipping out the front door, muttering apologies and excuses, not daring to look back. Ashley grabbed Richard and demanded he stop it, demanded he do something, but he stood frozen, surrounded by the wreckage, staring at my mother like a man facing judgment. Then his eyes found mine. I stood there, drenched, broken, trembling, but no longer alone, no longer invisible, no longer disposable. He spoke my name, and this time his voice held something real: fear, regret, the dawning realization of what he had done. He apologized, begged for forgiveness, insisting he hadn't understood. Now you know, I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. Now you know what it is to be shut out, to be treated like nothing. Tears spilled down his face as he said he was sorry, that he had been a fool, that I was his mother and he needed me. He begged me not to abandon him. His words pierced me deeply because he was right, he was my son. And even after everything he had done, despite the humiliation and the heartbreak, there was still a part of me that loved my son. That bond does not disappear easily. But my mother did not share that same fragile attachment toward him. She made it clear that I was not going to abandon Richard, but she also made it clear that she would do what I had never been willing to do. She intended to teach him the lesson he had refused to learn, that actions come with consequences. She turned to the lawyers and instructed them to move forward. She wanted this entire family removed from the property within 1 hour. What followed could only be described as complete chaos. Ashley crumpled to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Bertha shouted at the lawyers, hurling threats about lawsuits, ruined careers, and anything else her panicked mind could conjure. Richard just stood there, staring into nothing, as if his brain had simply shut down under the weight of what was happening. The bodyguards carried on with cold precision. Anything that symbolized comfort, luxury, or excess was targeted. High-end lamps were switched off. Electronics were unplugged and disconnected. In the master bedroom, even the designer clothing hanging neatly in the closet began to be packed away into large black bags. One of the lawyers checked his watch and restated the deadline. They had 1 hour. After that, anyone remaining on the property would be considered a trespasser and treated as such. Ashley finally dragged herself up, her face streaked with tears and smudged makeup. She screamed that it was insane, insisting they had rights, insisting that this could not be done to them. She said she would call her father, confident he knew powerful people, and would fix everything. My mother calmly interrupted and asked if she meant Mr. Albert Mendes, the same man who owed $3 million to a bank where she was the majority shareholder. She encouraged Ashley to make the call, remarking that he would surely be thrilled to hear his daughter wanted to complicate his situation even further. Ashley's face drained of color. Her mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. Bertha tried one last attempt at control. She announced they would go to a 5-star hotel and consult their own lawyers in the morning to undo all of this. My mother simply asked how they planned to pay for such a hotel stay. She calmly explained that Richard's bank accounts had already been frozen by court order roughly 15 minutes earlier, following an investigation into unauthorized debits, misuse of corporate funds, and other irregularities uncovered by her auditors. That finally jolted Richard from his stunned state. He demanded to know what irregularities they were talking about, insisting he had never done anything illegal. One of the lawyers stepped forward and opened another folder. He described personal expenses charged to corporate cards, leisure trips listed as business trips, and overpriced vendors hired in exchange for kickbacks. He asked if anyone cared to hear more. Richard stammered that it had not been just him, that everyone did those things, that such behavior was normal in the corporate world. The lawyer replied, in a tone as cold as stone, that normal did not mean legal, and that Richard's employment had been conditional on impeccable ethical behavior, a condition he had failed to meet. I watched it all in silence. I was still cold, still sore, but something inside me had shifted. I wouldn't call it satisfaction. It felt more like balance, as though the world had finally stopped letting him step on me without consequence. Richard turned to me again, more desperate than ever. He begged me to make it stop, insisted I still had influence over my mother. He promised he would change, that he would treat me better, that things would be different if only I stepped in. I found my voice, and when I spoke, it surprised even me. It was clear and firm, without a tremor. I told him it was enough. He looked at me with eyes full of abandonment, like a desperate animal, but I no longer felt the same aching pity. I reminded him that he had years to treat me with kindness. Years in which I cooked for him, cared for him, and supported him, only to be repaid with contempt. I reminded him how he had allowed his wife and mother-in-law to tear me down. How he had thrown me outside into the storm. That had been his choice. He burst out that he had never known his grandmother was wealthy, and the second the words left his mouth, he seemed to realize his mistake. The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate the room. I understood then what truly hurt him. It was not the pain he had inflicted on me. It was the loss of a fortune he had not even known existed. I said so quietly but plainly that he wasn't truly sorry for how he had treated me, only sorry for the money slipping through his fingers. The truth hovered in the air, undeniable, and no one tried to contradict it. My mother placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and told me it was time to leave. She said I needed medical care, warm clothes, and rest, and that this house, with all its glittering surfaces and rotten foundations, was no longer my concern. I asked where we were going, still struggling to process how quickly my life had turned upside down. She answered that we were going home, to my real home. We began to walk toward the door. The bodyguards moved instantly, forming a protective circle around us. Richard tried to follow but was blocked. He shouted after me, begging me not to abandon him, insisting that he was my only son. I stopped. I didn't turn around right away, but I stopped walking. When I finally spoke, my voice trembled with emotion but remained steady in its message. I told him that he had ceased to be my son the moment he locked me outside in the rain. A son did not do that to his mother. A son did not choose comfort and social status at the cost of his mother's suffering. He cried out that he loved me. I turned and looked at him. He was on his knees amid the debris and scattered documents, surrounded by the ruins of his celebration. He looked small, helpless, and pitiful. I told him he only loved the idea of having a mother to serve him and absorb his blame. That he loved the convenience, not the person. Real love did not treat anyone the way he had treated me. Ashley clung to Bertha, both of them crying. The woman who had been so arrogant, so mercilessly cruel, now looked like a lost, frightened older woman. Ashley called me Aunt Sarah, a title she had never once used before, and pleaded for mercy, saying they had nowhere to go. Years ago, I would have felt something crack open in my chest at that plea. But not now. Not after the rain, the door, and the years of contempt. I looked at the wall clock and reminded them they still had 50 minutes left. I suggested they start packing. We left the house while they were still frozen in disbelief. Outside, the chauffeur waited with the umbrella. The storm had softened into a light drizzle, but the air was still sharp and cold. My mother helped me into the back seat of the car. The interior was warm and luxurious, with heated leather seats and the faint scent of expensive perfume. She settled a soft blanket over me with great care and told me to rest. She said we would talk about everything later, but for now I needed to regain my strength. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and listened as she made phone calls. I heard her calmly arranging for a doctor to be on call, for new clothes to be prepared, for hot tea to be waiting at home. At her home. My new home. As the car rolled away, I could not help turning my head to look through the rear window. I saw the house glowing with artificial light as people rushed in and out, carrying belongings in frantic haste. I saw Richard still standing in the doorway, watching the car disappear down the street, his face wet from rain, tears, or both. And I felt nothing. The invisible cord that had tied me to his emotional hold had finally been cut. The drive to my mother's house took about 40 minutes. Halfway there, exhaustion overwhelmed me, and I drifted into a deep, heavy sleep. When I woke up, we were passing through massive gates guarded by security and watched by cameras. Beyond them stretched vast grounds, bathed in soft light even at night. Carefully tended gardens spread out in every direction. A long driveway lined with old trees led to a mansion at the very end. It was the kind of place I had only ever seen in movies. 3 stories high, classic architecture, wide balconies, and windows glowing warmly in the dark. I could barely find my voice as I asked if this was where my mother lived. She smiled, but there was sorrow in her eyes. She told me this had always been her main home. The modest ranch I had believed everything was real, but it was only one of her properties. This mansion stood in the most exclusive part of the city. I asked her why she had never told me the truth, why she had spent years letting me think she was just a simple woman living a humble life. She sighed and said that my father had met her when she was already wealthy and had used her. He had married her for her money rather than for love. When she discovered she was pregnant with me, he tried to blackmail her, threatening to take me away if she refused to give him half of her fortune. I stared at her in disbelief. I had never known any of this. She explained that she protected me by making a deal. He would stay away in exchange for regular payments, and she would raise me quietly, letting me believe we were ordinary people so I would not draw attention or become a target. When I grew up and chose a simple life, a modest marriage, a small home, an ordinary existence with my son, she had believed she had done the right thing. I asked if she had always known what was happening to me. She admitted that she had not always been fully aware. She reminded me that I had pulled away after Richard was born, determined to prove I could handle life on my own. She had respected that choice, but still kept people discreetly watching over us from a distance. In recent years, when she learned how ungrateful Richard had become and how he was treating me, rage had built inside her. She had wanted to intervene many times, but she knew how proud I was, proud in the same way she was. She believed I would not accept help easily. So she waited. She waited until the night it became unbearable. She ended by saying he crossed a line no one should ever cross, and he had done it tonight. The car stopped in front of the mansion, and when the door opened, a small group of staff stood waiting. Housekeepers, maids, a doctor carrying a medical case, all dressed impeccably, ready for whatever was needed. The next few hours blurred together. I was escorted to an enormous bedroom, larger than the living room of any home I had ever lived in. The bed alone looked big enough to hold a whole family. They brought me soft, warm clothing, cleaner and more comfortable than anything I had worn in years. The doctor examined me and confirmed I had mild hypothermia and severe stress. He gave me medication, advised rest, and insisted I take things slowly. I stepped into a hot bath, the longest, most soothing bath of my entire life. The heat melted into my skin, washing away not just the mud and cold, but a layer of pain that had been clinging to me for years. When I came out, there was a tray waiting with steaming soup, fresh bread, and tea sweetened with honey. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, every sip. My mother appeared after I finished, dressed now in soft loungewear. She asked how I felt. I told her I felt confused, that all of it was too much. She nodded gently and sat on the edge of the bed, saying it would take time to understand everything. But I needed to remember one truth. None of what happened was my fault. She said I had been an extraordinary mother, and what Richard had become was his choice, not a reflection of my failures. I insisted that maybe I had gone wrong somewhere, that if I had raised him better, maybe none of this would have happened. But she stopped me firmly. She said I had given love, dedication, and sacrifice. If he chose greed and cruelty, it was his character that failed, not mine. I asked what would happen to him now. Her expression hardened. She said he would learn to live without privileges he had never earned. The company had already terminated him. The house was being sold. His accounts were under audit. He would have to rebuild from the ground up, the same way I once had. I asked about Ashley and Bertha. She explained that Ashley had called her father, who erupted in fury upon learning how his daughter had ruined any chance of settling his massive debt. And Bertha, well, she would finally learn what it meant to depend on the mercy of others. I said it seemed cruel. She corrected me, insisting it was fair. She pulled me close and hugged me. It was the first time in decades that I felt truly safe. She whispered for me to rest, telling me tomorrow would begin a new chapter. And I did rest. I sank into that luxurious bed with its impossibly soft sheets and slept, really slept, with no nightmares, no interruptions, no dread creeping into my dreams. When morning sunlight streamed through the enormous bedroom window, I woke disoriented. For a moment, I didn't recognize where I was. Then the memories flooded back. The storm, the party, my mother, the destruction. I waited for a pang of regret or pain, but instead I felt something else, relief. A deep, cleansing relief I hadn't felt in years. A breakfast tray sat on a side table with fresh bread, fruit, juice, and fragrant coffee. Beside it was a handwritten note from my mother, asking me to eat slowly and meet her in the garden when I was ready. I savored every bite. It amazed me how good simple food tasted when it wasn't served with criticism or complaints. I found new clothes in the closet, elegant yet comfortable and perfectly fitted. My mother must have guessed my size or had someone shop overnight. When I went downstairs, a gentle maid guided me outside. The garden was breathtaking in the morning light, vibrant flowers, ornate fountains, old towering trees, and at the center, my mother sitting at a wrought iron table beneath a parasol. She greeted me warmly and asked if I had slept well. I told her it had been the best sleep I'd had in years. She poured tea for both of us and said we needed to discuss the future, my future. I repeated her words, unsure. I said I could barely think about the present. She reached for my hand, telling me I had spent decades living for other people, for Richard, for that ungrateful household, and now it was finally time to live for myself. I confessed I didn't know where to begin. She told me to start by letting her help, not because of obligation or pity, but because I was her daughter and because I deserved care. Over the next days, my life changed profoundly. My mother kept her promise about rebuilding. She brought in psychologists to help me heal, nutritionists to restore my health, and even an image consultant who treated me with respect while helping me rediscover my own style. But the greatest transformation came through education. My mother began teaching me about her companies, her properties, her investments. At first, it felt overwhelming. I told her I was just a housewife. What did I know about corporations and holdings? She reminded me that managing a home on a tight budget for years required strategy, discipline, negotiation, real skills that could translate into leadership. And slowly, I began believing her. She told me I had always been an executive at heart, I had just never been given the resources. 3 weeks after that terrible night, a letter arrived. It was from Richard. His handwriting was shaky, written on simple paper. My mother sat beside me while I read it. He wrote that sorry felt too small for what he had done, but it was all he had. He admitted I had been right, that he had been the worst version of himself. He said he treated me like trash when I deserved to be treated like a queen. He explained that his last days had been the hardest of his life. Ashley had left him and returned to her family, and was apparently already seeing someone else. Bertha barely spoke to him and blamed him for everything. He was living in a tiny rented room, working as a delivery driver, struggling even to pay rent. But he wrote something I didn't expect, that he deserved it. Every bit of the misery, he said, was what he now understood he had inflicted on me. He finally understood the cold, the loneliness, the abandonment, because now he was living a shadow of it himself. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He didn't expect it. He just wanted me to know he was sorry and that I had always been an incredible mother. The problem had always been him. He ended the letter by signing it as my son, if I still considered him one. I finished reading with tears in my eyes. My mother stayed silent and then asked what I wanted to do. I admitted I didn't know. A part of me longed to help him because he was still my child, but another part of me knew he needed to face the consequences. My mother told me I could still love him while allowing him to learn. Those two truths did not cancel each other out. I asked if she believed he had truly changed. She said she believed he was beginning to, but real change takes time, and a heartfelt letter doesn't erase years of cruelty. I put the letter away. I wasn't ready to answer him yet. Weeks passed and my transformation continued. It wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, spiritual. I was becoming someone new, confident, capable, resilient. My mother began including me in business meetings. At first, I simply observed, learning quietly. Eventually, I offered ideas and people listened, not because I was her daughter, but because what I said made sense. One executive told me I had a natural gift for leadership and asked if I had considered a permanent position. The question stayed with me. 2 months after the stormy night that changed everything, another letter arrived from Richard. He said he had found a better job, nothing glamorous but honest. He was saving money. He had started therapy. His psychologist told him he had a long road ahead, and he admitted I had been right about everything. He wasn't asking for anything now, only letting me know he was trying to become a better man for himself, not for money or appearances. This time, I wrote back. A short, neutral message wishing him luck, but making it clear reconciliation wasn't possible yet. My mother then made a suggestion. She said I should know the companies, not just through reports and numbers, but through the people and places that made them real. So I began visiting her factories, her offices, her stores. I spoke with managers, workers, customers, and I discovered something remarkable. I was good at it. People responded to me. Maybe it was because I had spent so many years at the bottom that I knew how to speak to others with empathy and sincerity. I knew how to listen. She ended by saying he crossed a line no one should ever cross, and he had done it tonight. The car stopped in front of the mansion, and when the door opened, a small group of staff stood waiting. Housekeepers, maids, a doctor carrying a medical case, all dressed impeccably, ready for whatever was needed. The next few hours blurred together. I was escorted to an enormous bedroom, larger than the living room of any home I had ever lived in. The bed alone looked big enough to hold a whole family. They brought me soft, warm clothing, cleaner and more comfortable than anything I had worn in years. The doctor examined me and confirmed I had mild hypothermia and severe stress. He gave me medication, advised rest, and insisted I take things slowly. I stepped into a hot bath, the longest, most soothing bath of my entire life. The heat melted into my skin, washing away not just the mud and cold, but a layer of pain that had been clinging to me for years. When I came out, there was a tray waiting with steaming soup, fresh bread, and tea sweetened with honey. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, every sip. My mother appeared after I finished, dressed now in soft loungewear. She asked how I felt. I told her I felt confused, that all of it was too much. She nodded gently and sat on the edge of the bed, saying it would take time to understand everything. But I needed to remember one truth. None of what happened was my fault. She said I had been an extraordinary mother, and what Richard had become was his choice, not a reflection of my failures. I insisted that maybe I had gone wrong somewhere, that if I had raised him better, maybe none of this would have happened. But she stopped me firmly. She said I had given love, dedication, and sacrifice. If he chose greed and cruelty, it was his character that failed, not mine. I asked what would happen to him now. Her expression hardened. She said he would learn to live without privileges he had never earned. The company had already terminated him. The house was being sold. His accounts were under audit. He would have to rebuild from the ground up, the same way I once had. I asked about Ashley and Bertha. She explained that Ashley had called her father, who erupted in fury upon learning how his daughter had ruined any chance of settling his massive debt. And Bertha, well, she would finally learn what it meant to depend on the mercy of others. I said it seemed cruel. She corrected me, insisting it was fair. She pulled me close and hugged me. It was the first time in decades that I felt truly safe. She whispered for me to rest, telling me tomorrow would begin a new chapter. And I did rest. I sank into that luxurious bed with its impossibly soft sheets and slept, really slept, with no nightmares, no interruptions, no dread creeping into my dreams. When morning sunlight streamed through the enormous bedroom window, I woke disoriented. For a moment, I didn't recognize where I was. Then the memories flooded back. The storm, the party, my mother, the destruction. I waited for a pang of regret or pain, but instead I felt something else, relief. A deep, cleansing relief I hadn't felt in years. A breakfast tray sat on a side table with fresh bread, fruit, juice, and fragrant coffee. Beside it was a handwritten note from my mother, asking me to eat slowly and meet her in the garden when I was ready. I savored every bite. It amazed me how good simple food tasted when it wasn't served with criticism or complaints. I found new clothes in the closet, elegant yet comfortable and perfectly fitted. My mother must have guessed my size or had someone shop overnight. When I went downstairs, a gentle maid guided me outside. The garden was breathtaking in the morning light, vibrant flowers, ornate fountains, old towering trees, and at the center, my mother sitting at a wrought iron table beneath a parasol. She greeted me warmly and asked if I had slept well. I told her it had been the best sleep I'd had in years. She poured tea for both of us and said we needed to discuss the future, my future. I repeated her words, unsure. I said I could barely think about the present. She reached for my hand, telling me I had spent decades living for other people, for Richard, for that ungrateful household, and now it was finally time to live for myself. I confessed I didn't know where to begin. She told me to start by letting her help. Not because of obligation or pity, but because I was her daughter, and because I deserved care. Over the next days, my life changed profoundly. My mother kept her promise about rebuilding. She brought in psychologists to help me heal, nutritionists to restore my health, and even an image consultant who treated me with respect while helping me rediscover my own style. But the greatest transformation came through education. My mother began teaching me about her companies, her properties, her investments. At first, it felt overwhelming. I told her I was just a housewife. What did I know about corporations and holdings? She reminded me that managing a home on a tight budget for years required strategy, discipline, negotiation, real skills that could translate into leadership. And slowly, I began believing her. She told me I had always been an executive at heart, I had just never been given the resources. 3 weeks after that terrible night, a letter arrived. It was from Richard. His handwriting was shaky, written on simple paper. My mother sat beside me while I read it. He wrote that sorry felt too small for what he had done, but it was all he had. He admitted I had been right, that he had been the worst version of himself. He said he treated me like trash when I deserved to be treated like a queen. He explained that his last days had been the hardest of his life. Ashley had left him and returned to her family, and was apparently already seeing someone else. Bertha barely spoke to him and blamed him for everything. He was living in a tiny rented room, working as a delivery driver, struggling even to pay rent. But he wrote something I didn't expect, that he deserved it. Every bit of the misery, he said, was what he now understood he had inflicted on me. He finally understood the cold, the loneliness, the abandonment, because now he was living a shadow of it himself. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He didn't expect it. He just wanted me to know he was sorry and that I had always been an incredible mother. The problem had always been him. He ended the letter by signing it as my son, if I still considered him one. I finished reading with tears in my eyes. My mother stayed silent and then asked what I wanted to do. I admitted I didn't know. A part of me longed to help him because he was still my child. But another part of me knew he needed to face the consequences. My mother told me I could still love him while allowing him to learn. Those two truths did not cancel each other out. I asked if she believed he had truly changed. She said she believed he was beginning to, but real change takes time, and a heartfelt letter doesn't erase years of cruelty. I put the letter away. I wasn't ready to answer him yet. Weeks passed and my transformation continued. It wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, spiritual. I was becoming someone new, confident, capable, resilient. My mother began including me in business meetings. At first, I simply observed, learning quietly. Eventually, I offered ideas and people listened, not because I was her daughter, but because what I said made sense. One executive told me I had a natural gift for leadership and asked if I had considered a permanent position. The question stayed with me. 2 months after the stormy night that changed everything, another letter arrived from Richard. He said he had found a better job, nothing glamorous but honest. He was saving money. He had started therapy. His psychologist told him he had a long road ahead, and he admitted I had been right about everything. He wasn't asking for anything now, only letting me know he was trying to become a better man for himself, not for money or appearances. This time, I wrote back. A short, neutral message wishing him luck, but making it clear reconciliation wasn't possible yet. My mother then made a suggestion. She said I should know the companies, not just through reports and numbers, but through the people and places that made them real. So I began visiting her factories, her offices, her stores. I spoke with managers, workers, customers, and I discovered something remarkable. I was good at it. People responded to me. Maybe it was because I had spent so many years at the bottom that I knew how to speak to others with empathy and sincerity. I knew how to listen. Over time, I realized I could sense when something was wrong in a business, even when the numbers looked fine. My mother explained that this was empathy at work, a rare and incredibly valuable trait in the corporate world. About 3 months later, she came to me with a direct proposal. She wanted me to run one of her companies. She made it clear it wasn't a favor or a case of nepotism, but something I had earned by proving my ability. I could hardly believe it. I protested that I had almost no formal experience. She corrected me. She reminded me I had 40 years of real-life experience, solving problems with almost no resources, managing crises, and pushing forward when everything seemed stacked against me. She said that kind of strength was worth more than any MBA. And that is how I became the general director, the CEO, of one of the group's subsidiaries. It was a medium-sized company, not gigantic, but profitable and solid. A perfect place to begin. Those first months were tough. I made mistakes, more than a few, but each one became a lesson. Gradually, the company began to grow under my leadership, not because of luck, but because of effort, listening to the right people, making hard choices when they were needed, and genuinely caring about the outcome. 1 year after that stormy night, I was no longer the same woman. My appearance had changed, yes, but more importantly, my essence had changed. I had found my purpose, my strength, and my voice. Exactly 1 year later, I received an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar, but something inside urged me to pick up. It was Richard. His voice sounded hoarse and nervous. He admitted he had no right to call, but he asked to see me just once. He said he needed to look me in the eyes and apologize in person, not through a letter or a phone line. He said I didn't need to forgive him, but he begged for that chance. I looked out my office, with my name on the door and a view over the city. I thought about how much I had grown and changed in 12 months. I told him I would think about it. He said that was all he could ask for and thanked me just for answering. After I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time. That evening, I told my mother about the call. She asked what my heart was saying. I admitted that I wanted to see whether his change was real, but I was afraid of being deceived again, of slipping back into the pattern of always returning no matter what. She told me I was not a fool and reminded me I was no longer the same woman I had been a year earlier. She said that if I chose to see him, it would be on my terms, in my space, with clear boundaries. He no longer held power over me. She was right. And that realization brought a sense of freedom I had never felt before. 2 days later, I arranged a meeting. Not at the mansion, not in a public cafe, but at my office. I wanted him to see me where I truly belonged now, in the world I had built for myself. When Richard walked into the conference room, I barely recognized him. He was thinner, older-looking, worn around the edges. His clothes were modest but tidy. The arrogance and polished entitlement he once wore like a second skin were gone. He froze when he saw me, his eyes widening. He told me I looked incredible. I sat on one side of the table in a tailored suit, my hair professionally styled, my makeup subtle but flawless. I looked every inch the successful woman I had worked to become. I gestured to the chair opposite me and asked him to sit. He sat down nervously, his hands shaking a little. For a while, we simply looked at each other, weighing what stood between us. I reminded him he had said he wanted to apologize in person and told him I was listening. He took a deep breath, as though preparing for the hardest speech of his life. He admitted he had been the worst version of himself. He said he treated me like garbage when I deserved reverence, chose status and money over real love, and threw out the very woman who gave him life as if I were worthless. Tears ran down his face as he spoke. He said the cruelest part was that he hadn't understood how wrong he was until he lost everything and found himself on the other side, cold, alone, abandoned. Only then did he truly grasp what he had done to me. He shared that the past year had been a kind of hell, but one he now believed he needed. He said hitting rock bottom forced him to look up and see just how far he had fallen. He told me he had started real therapy and uncovered painful truths about himself, that he had always felt insecure and inferior and had used me as a target to feel stronger. I asked about Ashley, keeping my voice steady. He said she had been with him for the money. The moment everything collapsed, she left. Now she was married to an older businessman. He told me Bertha had disappeared as well, and that he later found out she had been siphoning money from them. He said, with bitter clarity, that they had all been parasites feeding off one another. He looked directly at me and said he wasn't asking to come back into my life. He didn't expect financial help or support. He explained that he was working, paying his own bills, and building a modest but honest life. For the first time, he said he felt proud of himself, not because of possessions, but because of the person he was trying to become. I asked why he wanted to tell me all this. He said I deserved to know that my sacrifices had not been entirely wasted, that even though he had acted like a monster for a long time, The lessons I tried to teach him had not vanished. They were finally starting to grow inside him, even if it seemed late. I sat quietly, letting his words settle. A part of me wanted to believe him. Another part remained guarded and hurt. I told him I had heard what he said, and recognized that he was attempting to change. But I also made it clear that forgiveness was not something I could hand out simply because he asked for it kindly. He rushed to say he understood and didn't expect that. I continued anyway. I explained that forgiveness was a process, and honestly, I didn't know if I would ever be able to fully forgive what he had done that night. That night had shattered me in ways he would never completely comprehend. He lowered his head in shame. I went on. I told him I was willing to consider reconnecting slowly, but only with firm boundaries. If he had truly changed, he would have to prove it through his actions, not his words, over time, perhaps years. He lifted his gaze, and for the first time I saw genuine hope in his eyes. He said he would accept any condition, any rule, just for a chance to have some form of relationship with me, even if at first it was more like being acquaintances than mother and son. I told him the first condition was family therapy, sessions with both of us and a professional, because if we were going to rebuild anything, it needed to be done the right way. He agreed immediately, without hesitation. I made it clear he had to understand I was no longer the woman he could diminish or control. I had changed. I had grown. I had my own life and goals now, and I was not going back to who I had been. He said he didn't want me to go back. He said I was powerful and incredible now, and that this was who I should have always been if he hadn't held me down. I exhaled slowly and told him we could try, very gradually. But I warned him that, at the first sign of old patterns, I would walk away for good. He said he understood and promised not to disappoint me again. We ended that meeting with a handshake instead of a hug. It wasn't warmth yet, but it was a beginning, a new start, defined by my terms. After he left, I stayed in my office for a long time thinking. I wasn't sure whether my choice was perfect, but I knew one thing for certain. It was mine, and that difference mattered more than anything. The months that followed felt strange at first. Richard and I began seeing each other regularly, first only during family therapy sessions, and later for brief, intense coffee meetings. He honored his promises. He never asked for money. He didn't try to charm my mother or look for shortcuts. He simply showed up, talked honestly about his life, and listened when I spoke about mine. Slowly, very slowly, I started recognizing glimmers of the boy I had raised beneath the man he had become. Not completely, not fully, but faint sparks of him appeared. In one therapy session many months after we had reconnected, he said something that stayed with me. He was looking down at his hands while he spoke. He remarked on the irony of everything. He said he had spent so much of his life chasing wealth and importance that he lost the only thing that truly mattered, me. He admitted that when he had me, he already had everything, but he had been too young and foolish to understand it. The therapist watched us carefully and then asked me how I felt hearing that. I said I felt sad, because his words were painfully true. But I also felt relieved, because I was no longer the woman who needed to be needed in order to feel worthy. I had found my own value. Then the therapist asked Richard if he needed me now. He answered that he did not need me in the same way he had before. He explained that previously he had needed me to serve him, to prop up his ego, to be the emotional punching bag he took his frustrations out on. He went on to say that now he wanted me in his life, simply because I was his mother. Because I had loved him unconditionally, even when he didn't deserve it. And because he had finally learned how to love me the right way in return. I studied his face carefully, searching for signs of manipulation, excuses, or hidden motives. But all I found there was sincerity, raw, painful, unpolished, but real. The therapist noted that we were making meaningful progress. She reminded us that healing wasn't a straight line, there would be setbacks and difficult moments, but we were doing the work, both of us. After that session, Richard asked if we could talk a bit more. We walked to a nearby cafe and sat down. He fidgeted with his coffee cup like a man preparing to ask something fragile. He finally asked if I was happy, truly happy. The question took me off guard. I took a moment to think before answering. And when I said yes, I realized I meant it. I told him I woke each morning with a sense of purpose, with challenges that inspired me, surrounded by people who respected me. I told him I had a mother who supported me, and that I was learning to love myself in ways I never had before. He smiled, though the smile carried a shadow of sadness. He said he was glad that I deserved everything good that had finally come into my life. Then I asked him the same question. He said he didn't know if he was happy yet, but he was at peace. He explained that he no longer felt like the miserable man pretending to have everything. He said he had less now materially, but he felt richer inside. We sat quietly for a while, each reflecting on our own inner journeys. Then he asked something unexpected. Why had my mother waited so long to intervene? She could have stepped in years earlier. I explained what she had told me, that she had wanted me to live my own life, learn my own lessons, make my own choices. She had only intervened when my safety was at risk. He commented that my mother loved me deeply. I agreed and told him how much she was teaching me about business, about strength, about life. She was extraordinary. Then he asked whether I thought she would ever forgive him or even tolerate him again. I laughed softly, without humor. I told him my mother was not one to forgive easily and was fiercely protective of me. It would take a very long time, if at all. He seemed to accept that without protest. More time passed, 6 months of therapy turned into a year. Our meetings became less strained, more natural. We even found ourselves laughing sometimes over memories from his childhood. There had been good times buried beneath everything else. One day, Richard introduced me to someone new, his girlfriend. She was an elementary school teacher, a simple and gentle woman with a genuine heart. When she looked at him, it was with real affection, not calculation or greed. And when he looked at her, I saw a version of him I had never known, attentive, humble, sincere. He later told me she knew nothing about who he had been, only who he was now. And she loved him for who he was becoming. I warned him not to ruin it, half joking, half serious. He promised he wouldn't. It was during this time that something unexpected happened. My company was negotiating a major merger with another corporation. The process was complicated and required countless meetings. During one of those meetings, I discovered the CEO of the other company was Ashley's new husband, the wealthy man she had married after abandoning Richard. He recognized me immediately. We greeted each other with professional courtesy. When business was concluded, he asked to speak privately. He told me Ashley was attempting to sue Richard, accusing him of hiding assets during their divorce, an absurd claim, considering he'd had nothing. She was desperate, he said. She had burned through his money too, and now she was looking for another target. I asked why he was telling me this. He admitted he had been foolish too, drawn in by her beauty and allure, only to discover she drained everyone around her. He said he regretted not seeing the warning signs earlier, especially considering who Richard's family truly was. I thanked him and called Richard immediately. He already knew about the lawsuit but was handling it with an inexpensive lawyer. I surprised myself when I offered help. He tried to refuse, but I insisted. I told him it wasn't for him, it was for me. I refused to let that woman continue causing destruction in our lives. My mother's legal team took over. They dismantled the lawsuit swiftly, proving without question that Richard had no hidden assets and revealing evidence that Ashley had falsified documents. She was fined heavily and nearly faced criminal charges for fraud. Last I heard, she had moved to another state with her reputation in ruins. Karma had completed its work. 2 years after that stormy night, my life was unrecognizable. I wasn't just CEO of one company, but three. I worked with executives who respected me, who valued my insight. I spoke at conferences, participated in major decisions, and found myself consulted by leaders in different industries. Most importantly, I was happy, truly, deeply happy. Richard continued building his life. He married the teacher in a simple, heartfelt ceremony. I attended. My mother chose not to, her wounds were not healed, and I respected her decision. But I cried during the ceremony, overwhelmed with genuine joy. A few months later, they welcomed a baby girl. Richard called me from the hospital, his voice trembling with emotion. He told me I had a granddaughter and that he wanted to do things right this time. He said he wanted her to have the grandmother he once had, the strong, loving woman who had sacrificed everything. He promised he would love her fiercely and protect her. I told him I would love her too, but on my terms and in my time, and that I would never again allow myself to be used or diminished. He vowed never to repeat his past mistakes. When I held my granddaughter for the first time, something inside me, something wounded and aching, healed a little. Not completely. Some scars remain forever, but enough healing came to let me feel hope again. My mother eventually softened when it came to the child. She said she wouldn't punish an innocent baby for the sins of her father, though she made it clear Richard still had much to prove. And he did. Slowly, consistently, with daily actions rather than grand apologies. He called regularly just to ask how I was. He visited respectfully, always mindful of boundaries. His gratitude was sincere. One Sunday afternoon, nearly 3 years after that night in the storm, we were all at the mansion, me, my mother, Richard, his wife, and the baby. It felt strange and wonderful at once. Richard was playing in the garden with his daughter when my mother spoke. She admitted, almost reluctantly, that he had changed, truly changed. I agreed, but reminded her and myself that I would never forget what had happened. She told me I shouldn't. She said forgiveness wasn't forgetting, it was choosing not to let the past dictate the future. I looked at her, the woman who had saved me, transformed me, given me back my life. I thanked her through tears. She hugged me and told me I didn't need to thank her. I was her daughter, and she would do it all again. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in the same beautiful room where I had slept for the first time 3 years earlier, cold, broken, lost. I opened the journal I had begun during those early days. I reread the entries, the pain, shock, confusion, and later the strength and triumphs. I wrote a new entry. I realized I was no longer the woman who had been thrown out into the rain. That woman had died that night. What had risen in her place was someone stronger, wiser, more whole. I wrote that although I did not wish my suffering on anyone, it had transformed me. I had learned that love requires boundaries, that sacrifice is not martyrdom, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and that starting over is always possible. Richard remained in my heart, but he was no longer the center of it. I was. My mother had given me the chance to rebuild, but I chose what to build. I chose strength, beauty, purpose. Her revenge had never been about destruction for its own sake. It was about destroying the version of me that accepted crumbs, that confused pain with love. That version had to be erased so a new one could rise. And rise I did from rain, from ashes, from heartbreak. Tonight, as I looked out at the sky full of stars, with no storm in sight, I felt peace, profound, quiet peace. The word my mother spoke that night, destroy, had been about rebirth, and I had finally been reborn.